just go into some of the strengths. Spend a little bit more time talking about some of the strengths. With respect, the first is this point about revolutionary discipline, politicization, and collective mobilization. Let me give the word back to Muslim Muhammad. He says, everyone knows, it's a nice reflection with respect to, we just had elections in this country, so everyone knows how capitalist democracy plays for the votes. It is a play of elections. In many places, parliamentary elections are just about propaganda, only addressing the direct self-interest of the voter. Democratic autonomy is about the long term. It is about people understanding and exercising their rights, to get society to become politicized. That is the core of building democratic autonomy. In Europe, you will find a society that is not politicized. Political parties are only about persuasion and individual benefits, not about actual emancipation and politicization. Real democracy is based on a politicized society. If you now go to Kobane, and he was saying this back in November when the fighting was still on, and you meet the fighters, and still on, but when Kobane was still under siege, and you meet the fighters of the YPG and the YPJ, you will find that they know exactly why they are fighting and what they are fighting for. They are not there for money or interests. They are there for elementary values which they practice at the same time. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. I want to emphasize this point because this is a point that resonates with a long tradition of revolutionary thought and radical democratic thought, going back to at least having its roots in Rousseau. And Rousseau, what Rousseau has to say in The Social Contract, let me just quote Rousseau on this because I think the resonance is clear. Rousseau in Book 3, Chapter 15, on deputies or representatives, what he says, as soon as public service ceases to be the chief business of the citizens, and they would rather serve with their money than with their persons, the state is not far from its fall. When it is necessary to march out to war, they pay troops and stay at home. When it is necessary to meet in council, they name deputies and stay at home. By reason of idleness and money, they end up by having soldiers to enslave their country and representatives to sell it. Okay. so anyhow, there's a Rousseauian motif there, which also later gets picked up, I think, by Karl Marx in the early Marx in particular, on the Jewish question, his critique of mere political emancipation and thinking about this kind of bifurcated, alienated consciousness of people in political society of Germany of his day. Here's what Marx has to say, and I think again resonates with this idea. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. Where the political state, says Marx and on the Jewish question, where the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought, in consciousness, but in reality and life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and an earthly life. Life in the political community, in which he considers himself a communal being, and life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as a means, degrades himself into a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. Okay, so there's something about this fusion between what they do and what they represent, linked into a deep aspiration for a radical participatory understanding of democracy. And in fact, the revolutionaries themselves use this language of radical democracy, which they link into a notion of revolutionary self-defense. And I want to say something about that. But let me just quote Muslim Muhammad for one last time. He says, "We are engaged in the construction of radical democracy, to mobilize people to organize themselves and to defend themselves by means of people's armies like the People's Defense Unit and Women's Defense Unit. We are practicing this model of self-rule and self-organization without the state as we speak. So the People's Defense Unit is the YPG, and then the particular women's militias are the YPJ, who I did get a chance to see some of these battalions. So other people will speak of self-rule in theory, but for us, this search for self-rule is our daily revolution. Women, man, all strands of our society are now organized. The reason why Kobane still stands is because we have built these structures. So these structures, which are understood to be radical, participatory, democratic structures linked into a revolution of consciousness, which I'll get back to. But it's also a revolution that understands itself as clearly against a revolution against the statist mentality. Okay, so this is just to conclude with Muslim Muhammad, one last quote from him. He says, "We have in essence developed a democracy without the state. That is a unique alternative in a region plagued by the internally conflicted Free Syrian Army, the Assad regime, and the self-proclaimed Islamic State. Now, along those lines, Dr. Hussein Koser, who was a YPG commander at the military headquarters in Sarakani, who we got to interview, he said something. He said, "We don't operate as a state and don't aim to, but our mobilization is stronger than 10 states. We are not aiming at a statist mentality, but rather to organize the people. The people can be without the state, though the state cannot be without the people." So here again, this resonates with a long-standing critique of the state, but it also, as citizens of a very powerful nation states and the role of the modern state in everyday life, this cuts against very much the mainstream understanding of the state being the guarantor of the peace and social order on the one hand, and also a compulsory association with a territorial basis. So there's a sense in which what they're doing is understanding a radical democracy that is a logic that is different from a state logic. Okay, so outside of the Weberian understanding of what the state is, and also outside of a Hobbesian conception that against, if you have a breakdown of the social order and the onset of a time of war, that in that time of war, as Hobbes would put it in the Leviathan, chapter 13, he says, in that time of war, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So there are some elements that are undeniable in this war situation in Rojava and in Syria generally, where there's been lots of human suffering. I don't know, I've seen figures around 300,000 people dead in the Syrian conflict, tons of refugees in the Syrian conflict. But at the same time, it is true that against this Hobbesian nightmare, so to speak, you see this radical revolutionary rupture and a revolutionary instance and a revolutionary opportunity. And one that, in particular, one of the interesting things is that there's this emphasis in the revolution, amongst the revolutionary forces, in education and consciousness raising. They're setting up academies, doing all kinds of educational pedagogy, revolutionary educational pedagogy. So it's not a time of no letters or no society, so to speak, even though in many respects there's a lot of, there's definitely fear among some people, but not these cadres necessarily, and there's a lot of violent death going around. So this gets to this issue of understanding the revolutionary situation. 10 minutes, okay, perfect. The revolutionary situation, what we know about revolutions, and what now, and something that Marx himself was famously, has been accused at least of ignoring, is the importance of a crisis of the state, in fact, in creating an opportunity for a revolutionary rupture. So just to go to, for example, Theda Skocpol's important work on revolution, states and social revolutions, she points out that there must be a crisis of a state, often provoked by international factors, such as increasing economic or security competition from abroad. It is a crisis, not merely a challenge, because this is a challenge that the state cannot meet given its current institutional constraints. As a result, elites and the army become divided over what to do, and loyalty to the regime weakens. This crisis of the state creates the revolutionary situation. So she's speaking in a kind of general theory of revolutions, and certainly there's a crisis of the state that helps explain the emergence of this revolutionary opportunity. So that said, let me now just say one more point about the resonance between this democratic and federal model that emerges, flowers, so to speak, out of this revolutionary situation and this crisis of the state. And there's another affinity with what Marx described in the 1870s, in 1870 in Paris, particularly the Paris Commune. So when Marx says, when he describes the Commune, there's something that is very similar in his description of the Commune to the way in which these people describe and try to justify the revolutionary form of radical democratic governments. He says, the Commune was to be the political form of even even the smallest country hamlet, and that in the rural districts the standing army was to be replaced by a national militia with an extremely short term of service. The rural communities of every district were to administer their common affairs by an assembly of delegates in the central town, and these district assemblies were again to send deputies to the national delegation in Paris, each delegate to be at any time revocable and bound by the mandat imperatif, formal instructions of his constituents. And then he goes on to say, the unity of the nation was not to be broken, but on the contrary to be organized by communal constitution and to become a reality by the destruction of the state power, which claimed to be the embodiment of that unity, independent of and superior to the nation itself, from which it was but a parasitic excrescence, he says. So there's something about this form that recalls the kind of this emergent radical revolutionary form of governance. Now, let me just say a few more things about this consciousness raising, and I think this is a really interesting element of insisting upon the politicization, this revolutionary politicization of the people as being part of the success of this revolution. So this is in the words of Alder Zelil, who's a member of the coordinating committee of Tevdem, which is a sort of umbrella organization associated with the revolutionary forces in control in Rojava. He says, one of the main reasons for our success has been the mobilization of a societal revolution. Many believed that when the regime fell, democracy would automatically emerge, but we didn't. A democratic system is not just a matter of laws and constitutions. A democratic system is a way of life. We do not believe it is just about changing a leader, but about creating a mentality in society, a revolution for society. It is not just about changing leaders. And then he goes on to say, wherever we go, we don't go there to make them be us. We want to secure that they can be themselves. We try to make them own their own political will. Through discussions raising political consciousness, many have joined the YPJ. We are constantly engaged in the struggle to change mentalities. So there's this struggle that they mentioned, that this revolutionary struggle is part of this kind of consciousness-raising effort. And this again has great resonance with the revolutionary tradition, going back to, and let me cite, because of the polemical nature perhaps, Che Guevara, what Che Guevara had to say about consciousness-raising, and be thinking about this issue, because a lot of these people who are doing this revolutionary pedagogy are themselves paramilitary forces and the people in arms as well, linked into the people in arms. So what Guevara says back in 1965, he says the sermons of the past have been transposed to the present in the individual consciousness, and a continual labor is necessary to eradicate them. The process is two-sided. On the one side, society acts through direct and indirect education. On the other, the individual subjects himself to a process of conscious self-education. The new society being formed has to compete fiercely with the past. The latter makes itself felt in the consciousness in which the residue of an education systematically oriented towards isolating the individual still weighs heavily. So this idea that the past weighs heavily, and the past of oppression, the past regimes need to be the people need to be uneducated, re-educated, this idea. And this is not only an idea that can be linked back to the guerrilla tactics of someone like Che Guevara, but also to bring it back to Murray Bookchin again in his discussion on confederalism. He says, confederalism is thus the ensemble of decentralization, localism, self-sufficiency, interdependence, and more. This more is the indispensable moral education and character building, what the Greeks called paideia, that makes for rational active citizenship in a participatory democracy, unlike the passive constituents and consumers that we have today. In the end, there is no substitute for a conscious reconstruction of our relationship to each other and to the world.